The Harris campaign is making an aggressive last-minute effort to win over younger male voters, investing in a series of ads on male-dominated sports and video game sites like DraftKings and Yahoo Sports. Joining us now, the co-founder of the Young Men Research Initiative, Aaron Smith, and co-founder and president of Woodbury Hit Strategies, Terrence Woodbury. Good morning to you both.
Okay, let's just lay it on the table for us, okay? Aaron, you first lay it out, and then Terrence, give us some of the data. What the hell is going on here? Because everybody's talking about it. How real is it? Is it fake? What? Just give me the tea.
So Joe Biden won young men with 54% of the vote in 2020. That was about 7 million votes. Clearly, Donald Trump is making a whole strategy around appealing to young men. He wants to flip them. We can't let that happen. But there's a couple key things to realize. Our research at Young Men Research Initiative shows that young men are overwhelmingly progressive on a range of policy issues, just like young women, and that includes things like abortion rights, and that's true across race and across class. Second, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is happening across the globe, and Kamala Harris is actually doing substantially better with young men than Joe Biden was doing when he dropped out. But Democrats do have a messaging problem. Only 33% of young men now identify as Democrats. That's down from over 40% in 2020. So we only have 3 weeks left, less than 3 weeks left in this election. Republicans are outspending Democrats 4-1 when it comes to targeting young men with online ads, and that's 10-1 in key swing states like Pennsylvania. So it's great that Kamala Harris is talking about going on Joe Rogan. It's great that Tim Walz is going on sports shows and that they're targeting online ads to fantasy football viewers. We need to persuade young men, and we need to turn them out. This is a persuadable group, but we can only persuade them if we get in front of them.
Terrence,
yeah. Yeah, look, young men are emerging as a new swing voter, right? Previous elections have focused on suburban women as swing voters, soccer moms as swing voters, and what we're seeing is that young men are really emerging as the swing voter that will determine the outcome of this election. We knew that they would be tuning in later. We knew that they would be a little bit more disengaged from the cycle. But as they are tuning in, you see the vice president making this concerted effort to go after their votes. I do want to correct the record specifically on black men, because that has been a lot of the topic of conversation recently. Where black men are being both underrepresented and misrepresented in some of the traditional research. Because look, while there has been some softening amongst black men over time, since the 2012 cycle, we've seen Democrats doing a little bit of erosion amongst that key voting bloc of black men. But the vice president has been taking concerted efforts, meeting them where they are, communicating on the issues that matter to them, reducing cost, creating wealth. And that's why she's put forth the opportunity agenda. And what we've seen in focus groups and in polls is that as they are introduced to what she has been doing over the past 4 years and what she will do over the next 4 years, that they are in fact persuadable and they are moving in her direction.
So, how about this?
just say it.
Yeah, spit it out.
How about this? Young men perceive Democrats as the party of women. Young men perceive the GOP as the party of men. And as a consequence of that, despite what you just laid out in terms of their more progressive views on policy, how does that fit in with the perception narrative that we see playing out? There's a reason why you're seeing the more aggressive push by Republicans on sports platforms, gambling platforms especially, and this sort of heavy-handed machoism that, to be quite honest, denigrates women to some extent and lays out narratives about women that is not necessarily appealing. And yet within that framing, you have women sort of reinforcing that. I've seen enough coming out of the GOP with, the scantily clad women having these conversations with young men, sort of this sexualization of the conversation. So I'll just put that right here in the middle, and the gentleman can do what they want with it, because I think that is you know, in your study and research, are you finding some of that? And how does that play into the mix?
I just want to be on record that I am against the notion that the Democratic Party is a party of women. I understand that that may be the sentiment that some people have, but I think that it is like the men are still very much in trouble.
Well, I think it behooves Republicans to act as though it's zero sum.
Right, exactly. So I think we need a long-term strategy around young men. It's not going to be solved in 3 weeks. You know, partly it's about talking about the Democratic agenda and our policy wins as things that are specifically good for men. We need to be comfortable doing that. Give one example. The Affordable Care Act led to a huge reduction in the number of uninsured men, but you never hear Democrats talking about it in that way. Young men are the most supportive of unions and labor rights. Again, the Democratic Party agenda is a good one for young men, but we actually need to try to sell that. We need to show that we are fighting for their votes. The other thing I'd say on the zero-sum game point is this is exactly what the Republicans want. They want to divide groups. They want to pit one group against each other. So the Democratic Party needs to be the party for everyone. We need to acknowledge that in a million ways, women have not achieved true equality in this country, whether it's on pay gap or in abortion rights. We also need to acknowledge that many young men are struggling with the economy and in their education. We can do both things at once. But again, we need to make that argument. We need to be fighting for their votes. And the last thing I'll say is, for those 20-year-olds where this is their first election, they're not going away. This is a long-term trend. We need to show that we are fighting for their votes because they're going to continue to be an incredibly important voting bloc in this country.
I'm struggling. I am struggling because I don't know. Since when does... How do we get to a place where talking about other people means that someone else is going by the wayside?
But that's Trumpism.
That's Trumpism.
That's Trumpism. It's a scarcity mindset.
Yeah, zero-sum proposition.
I mean, and part of this, I think, Terrence, that Aaron is getting it so right when he talks about the fact that it's one thing to talk about what the Harris campaign and the DNC needs to do in the next 2.5 weeks, and it's another thing to talk about a long-term strategy. Some of that is sociocultural, and some of it is political. I want to read you this, a new piece from Richard Reeves in Politico. Since 1980, young men have registered and voted at lower rates than young women in every presidential election. And the turnout gap has only increased in recent election cycles. In the 2020 presidential election, turnout for young women was 11 percentage points higher than young men. Polling from Gallup last week speaks to the problem. Supporters of former President Donald Trump between the ages of 18 to 29, who are mostly men, just aren't enthusiastic about voting. Only 34% say they are extremely motivated to vote, compared to 50% for young voters of Vice President Kamala Harris. When we do talk, Terrence, about the next 2.5 weeks, there is the reality that, yes, Donald Trump may have the support of some of these young men in polling, but these are often low propensity voters. What does that then mean for the Harris campaign, for the Trump campaign?
Yeah, look, I think all of that is exactly right. Look, this group of voters are absolutely aligned with Democrats on the issues, right? But there is a nature of hyper-masculinity that Republicans are injecting into their politics that has become characteristic of Republican campaigning. That look, Democrats, a part of the long-term strategy here, right, is redefining masculinity. That it's not all toxic. That there is a role of masculinity not just in the Democratic Party but in society. That the role of men is evolving and not reducing. And that's a part of the messaging that we just have to continue to explain far beyond this election. But I think the point that you make is important, that a part of what is driving this increased support amongst young black men, the generation gap and not just the gender gap, it is a frustration, not just with Democrats, but with the system, right? And a part of the attraction to Donald Trump is that he's offering to blow up the system. Right, and so we have to reinforce their faith, their confidence in the franchise, in the actual governing system. That is a longer-term conversation. But for the next 2 weeks, we have to convince them not just that Donald Trump is going to be worse for them on the issues that matter, but that Kamala Harris has a plan, and that the opportunity agenda will actually improve their lives over the next 4 years.
I have to go, but before we go, I need you to just list the 3 states where these young men represent a large proportion of the electorate.
Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin.
I mean,
And that is why we're having this
Exactly right.
conversation.
my head hurt. My head hurt. My
I
head
just
hurt.
have one point to
But I
make,
appreciate
though.
the nuance.
Yeah, I
What you
appreciate the
gonna say?
nuance too. But when you blow up your house, what you got,
Nowhere to live.
right? So if he wants to blow everything up, then what? And that's the rest of this that Trumpism does not answer. And I think that's an opening to your point.
Absolutely.
And Aaron Smith, Terrence Woodbury, we're going to ask you to come back in December so we can talk about that.
We need to continue to chat more, okay? Help us.